And welcome to this week's chat, all things Ukraine, with our Professor of Security and Defence Analysis, Michael Clarke, who's with me here. Michael, lovely to see you. And as usual, hundreds of you have sent in your questions. And we're going to be talking through them in the next half hour. Michael, let's dive straight in. Last week, we had the Coalition of the Willing meeting in London on Friday. Did anything substantive come from it for Ukraine in terms of what they were hoping for?
Nothing they can talk about, but it's more planning and more intentions from the Europeans. They're casting around to say, look, who's got what in military terms that we can send to Ukraine? Who can lay hands on more artillery shells, more drone technologies that they might need, more components, and more air defence assets in particular, and more missiles. So the Coalition of the Willing is from Ukraine's point of view, what it's always been. It's a way of trying to, as it were, placate the White House that the Europeans are ready to support any peace deal if there is one. But behind that is the expectation that there won't be a peace deal. So the same coalition will be trying to help Ukraine carry on without too much American help. It doesn't look as if the Americans will pull the plug entirely at the moment, but the Americans will give some minimal intelligence and targeting help to Ukraine. That's what they are doing so far. And that they will allow the Europeans to buy certain weapons to give them to Ukraine. And I think the expectation is that's the way it's probably going to be into next year. So the Coalition of the Willing, everyone's very rude about it because they assumed it was naive and so on. In one way, it was deliberately naive. It was doing its best to support the White House. But actually, it's a military planning process to help Ukraine in various ways to keep going if the Ukrainians are determined that that's what they've got to do.
Well, they seem to be determined, don't they? And on Monday, President Zelenskyy said that his allies were putting together a ceasefire plan in the next 10 days, which was sort of positive from their point of view. We've had a question from John, and he asks, what is the plan that Ukraine is likely to put forward?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone's seen a public version of it yet, but it's a variation, we assume, on the plan of March. I mean, in March, the Ukrainians agreed, under pressure from the Americans, to a ceasefire in place. They originally were talking then about, well, there's a ceasefire on the ground, in the air, at sea, and we could have different levels of ceasefire according to which domain we're talking about. The Americans said, no, you've got to have a whole ceasefire. So the Ukrainians, against their own instincts, to be honest, they said, OK, well, we'll deal with it. That's what we'll do, and we'll deal with it. And they agreed a ceasefire in place. We just stop fighting wherever we are now. And, of course, that's what the Russians won't agree to because they don't want a ceasefire because they think they're winning, which, in a way, they're only winning at a very local level. They're not winning strategically. But Putin thinks that he will keep going, he will win. He's very confident that ultimately he will win, so he doesn't want a ceasefire. And, again, the Ukrainians are coming up with more ceasefire plans to keep. They don't care what Putin thinks about it. They know he won't be impressed. They're trying to convince the White House that, of course, we'll back anything. You know, we are flexible. The idea is that neither the Ukrainians nor the Europeans want to look as if they are the problem. Because as and when the United States zigzags out of this conflict, as I still think they will, Trump is zigzagging his way out of involvement in the war. The question is, who does he blame at the point at which he says, that's it, you know, a plague on both your houses. And the Europeans and Ukraine are very careful. They're trying to do all they can to make sure that they don't get the blame, because any sensible analyst knows that, I mean, this war was started by a Russian invasion and Russia's determination to suppress Ukraine as an independent state. But the White House never wanted to, the Trump White House didn't want to see it that way. And for a while, if you remember, I mean, after the inauguration in January, Americans wouldn't even allow a G7 document to say the word invasion. They couldn't say that following the Russian invasion. I don't know what else they thought 190,000 troops crossing the border could be described as.
Special military operation.
Exactly, special military operation, yeah. But the idea was then that, this had to be seen as an unfortunate military conflict in which we're not going to allocate blame one way or another. And of course, for the Europeans in Ukraine, that's absurd. And to most external analysts, it's completely absurd. And the Americans have come away from that a bit now because Trump has got very annoyed with Putin. But all of these diplomatic moves on the part of the Europeans in Ukraine are all really directed at the White House. So that as and when this process fails, Trump doesn't blame us. They don't see the Europeans or Ukraine as the problem. The problem is Putin's Russia.
And which John's second part of his question was, it sort of answered that really. Is this just tactics rather than a serious proposal to add pressure to Putin?
It's tactics, just keep up the momentum on Putin, who does seem now, for different reasons, to be feeling the pressure more than he was about a month ago. Both with some European determination, the prospect of the freezing of these frozen assets being effectively given to Ukraine as a major loan, 140 billion euros worth, which would be considerable, and the idea that the United States is now sanctioning the two major oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft, which is more than 50% of Russia's oil exports. I mean, we're not sure yet what impact that is having. It depends on whether the buyers stop buying from those two. I think they probably will, but the buyers are backing off at the moment to see what happens. It'll take probably a month before we really realise whether is seriously going to hurt the Russian economy. But undoubtedly, the Russians are beginning to feel the pressure now on a number of different fronts.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to monitor the impact the oil decision has, won't it? We'll keep coming back to that, I think, in the weeks to come. Yeah. Staying with Russia, and from their point of view, Putin and Russia said this week that they'd tested a new nuclear missile. I've had a question from Sean Hutchinson. He says, one, he loves your weekly sessions, by the way. So thanks, Sean. It's always lovely to throw a bit of smoke at Michael's way. Sean says, does Putin's nuclear test have any significance other than to add fear to the West? Is it just saber-rattling? It's
certainly saber-rattling, the Burevestnik missile, I'm not sure if I got the pronunciation right, the Burevestnik, but it's storm petrel in Russian. And NATO calls it, theatrically enough, Skyfall. It's called the Skyfall missile. And this is a nuclear missile. So there's no fuel on it. It doesn't carry fuel. It just carries a nuclear reactor. And the principle of it is that it just sucks in air and heats it instantly and throws it out the back as a jet propulsion. So the nuclear reactor just turns air into jet-fueled air and pushes it along. And so it carries a warhead, a nuclear warhead, 300 kilotons is advertised by the Russians. And when people think, what does that mean? The unit of measurement is always 15 kilotons. That was Hiroshima. The Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons. So this is 300 kilotons. So, put it back with an envelope together 20 times. So it's about 20 times a Hiroshima on the warhead. And the idea is that the Russians, after lots of failed tests, incidentally, they actually had explosions up in Archangel in the testing ground in 2019, I think it was. They had lots of failed tests of this. They finally got it to work, and at least a prototype. It'll be some years before we see these, if we see them. But they got it to stay in the air for, according to the Russians, about 18 hours. It covered about 8,000 miles. And the theory is it's a cruise missile. It can travel very low and it can move around. It could stay airborne a long, long time. It could go over the Atlantic and go in circles, and then it could suddenly dive onto its target. So it's very hard to defend against. That's the idea. However, there are some disadvantages to this thing. One is even with this nuclear reactor on board, heating the air instantly, its maximum speed is about 600 miles an hour. Now, in military terms, that's not very fast, because that's just the speed of a civilian airliner up at 30,000 feet. Any defence system could hit it at 600 miles an hour. And a ground-based or sea-based air defence, an aircraft could catch up with it. A combat aircraft would easily catch up with it and shoot it down. That's one problem.
But if an aircraft explodes this nuclear warhead, what then happens to the charge?
No, the warhead almost certainly wouldn't go off until it gets to its target. Warheads, tend not to work more than they work. But what would happen, that's really important, what would happen is that if it's brought down, then you've got a nuclear accident. Supposing it was brought down over Europe or Belarus or preferably over Russia, then the nuclear reactor is splinters and splits up, and then you've got a nuclear leak. And that would be an instant problem. The Americans looked at this years ago. I mean, this technology has been, in theory, available for a long time. The Americans decided it just wasn't worth it, having a nuclear reactor running around the world at 600 miles an hour. And also, I think this thing would have a fair chance of being shot down, because I would guess that it's got the radar signature of an elephant. It won't be hard to track. And it'll be leaving a little trail of neutrons behind it. And if this thing is travelling at, say, 100 metres above the Earth for 18 hours with a nuclear reactor on board going at 600 miles an hour, it'll trigger every sensor that it passes over. It won't be hard to work out where this thing is. And it will at 600 miles an hour, it'll take a long time to reach America or even Western Europe. So there's quite a lot of time to shoot it down. The question is then, if you shoot it down, it is a nuclear accident. It's been described as a mini Chernobyl. So this is a very reckless weapon. It's far less usable than you might imagine, even though it carries a very big warhead. And so why are the Russians doing it? And I think it was, the idea is it a political...
Yes, he said it. doesn't have any significance other than to add to the fear to the West, or is it saber rattling?
It certainly has to fear, but there is one, if you like, more. I mean, all nuclear strategy is all lunatic, right? It is all madness, by design.
Yeah.
And this one is more loopy than most. However, the New START treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, comes up for renewal next year, next February. It's the only bit of arms control we've got left. We used to have lots of it, and in the last 10 years, it's all disappeared. The only bit we've got left is the START treaty. And this weapon may be a bargaining chip in the negotiations which the Americans and the Russians are going to be having over that, because this is neither a tactical nor a strategic weapon. It's both. It's a weapon. Cruise missiles are tactical weapons used on the battlefield generally. But this one can go so far, so fast, it could reach any continent in the world. So it's strategic. So this weapon is in between all the definitions that people normally use. And it could be regarded as a bargaining chip in the negotiations for renewing the New START treaty next year. That's the only politically sensible reason I can think of why the Russians might want to do it now, other than to make everyone nervous. But any analyst will tell you this is a reckless weapon which would be really hard to use in a militarily sensible way, and it will cause a lot more harm to everybody else than it does to whoever you think the enemy is.
Yeah. Also, this week, the Russian authorities say Ukraine has targeted Moscow with drones. Nothing new there. But N. Stevens asks, what is the reason for this recent drone attack? Are they targeting the government? And then a second question about, will they cause Russian citizens to turn against Putin through these kind of drone incursions?
Well, in a way, yes to the second bit and no to the first, I would say. I mean, drone attacks on Moscow are certainly not going to target the government successfully. I mean, they won't work. I mean, Moscow's covered by, last time I looked, it was 3 Panacea air defense systems, which all overlap. So it's like 3 layers of air defense, very tight, against missiles and aircraft. But drones, because they're slow or slower, have a way of penetrating. But drones can't carry that much of a warhead. And they've done little bits of damage to the roof of the Kremlin. They started a fire up there, and somebody got injured. One of the firemen who was climbing up the dome to put it out hurt himself. Apparently, that was the worst they've done to the government.
Quite audacious, though, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah, it was audacious. And the point is, these drone attacks on Moscow, some of them are attacks on military facilities on the edge of Moscow. And Moscow, you remember, it's a city of 20 million people, so it's a big area. It's a big urban area. So some of them are genuinely military attacks. But the others are designed to close Moscow's airports. There's 4 big airports in Moscow, and they're now closed on a regular basis. Every week they're closed for 24 hours, 36 hours, particular disruptions to flights. And I think the Ukrainians have realized this is a really good way to annoy the Russian public and bring home to the Russian public that this war is not cost-free. You can't pretend that this war isn't going. And the point is that because of the pattern of recruitment of Russian forces, they've recruited mainly from the east, from the poorer peoples in Buryat and in Siberia. And the citizens of Moscow and Petersburg are really not touched by the war very much at all until their airports get closed, until they feel the disruption. So I think that's why the Ukrainians do it. That's one of the benefits for them of doing it. Will it bring Putin down? No, it won't. A popular revolt in Russia is absolutely impossibility now because it's so repressive. And the war is still, in a way, I wouldn't say it's popular, but the Russian public react like all publics. They want their boys to do well. They don't want to lose. And so they kind of, through gritted teeth, they support their boys fighting in a foreign country or in another territory, as far as they're concerned. If Putin is brought down by pressure, it's going to be people around him. And they always say it's the Julius Caesar finish for him. I mean, it's either be a knife in the back, either a real knife or a political knife. And Prigozhin tried it. I mean, the leader of the Wagner group, he tried what looked like a coup, and it was pathetic in a way. And, of course, he failed, and the result was he was dead within a month in an unexplained air crash. Yeah. Whoever strikes the first blow, as in Julius Caesar's own experience, whoever strikes the first blow has got to succeed. And then everybody else will come in. Everybody else will plunge their knife in. But whoever casts the first knife, whether it's political or real, has got to make sure they do a good job.
Got to finish it.
Yeah.
Well, on the subject of opposition within Russia, CMC asks you whether you could explain who the Russian military bloggers are who often contradict the official Putin line, because there aren't many who are willing to speak up publicly. Wants to know how they get away with it without being persecuted, if indeed they do at all.
They don't. No, they don't get. Well, yeah, Igor Girkin did. I mean, he was Igor Girkin was the the guy who was responsible for bringing down the Malaysian airliner over Ukraine back in 2017, I think it was, and he was fighting with the militias in Luhansk and Donetsk, and he's an absolutely indicted war criminal. And he was a very prominent blogger until he was arrested about 3 years ago, I think. Now, we haven't heard from him since then. But Igor Girkin, he was...
Do you know what's happened to him?
I don't, actually. I think he's still alive, but I don't think he certainly is not public. And he was quite a popular figure because he's typical of the bloggers in that he's an ultra-nationalist. His argument with the Kremlin is not that you shouldn't be doing this, but you should be doing it more fiercely. And so all of these bloggers are ultra-nationalists who are angry with the military, the Russian military, for their inefficiency, and angry at the Kremlin for restraining itself from using nuclear weapons. You should be nuking them. You should get on with it. And so all of these bloggers are, if you like, more bloodthirsty than Putin, which is one reason in a way why the Kremlin lets it happen. But they kind of altogether stop it. And the thing about the bloggers, most of them are on Telegram channel. So there's a guy called Alexander Kog, I think it is, who he writes for Komsomolskaya Pravda, and he's a columnist, but he's a very, very prominent blogger. And people believe him because he's a frontline journalist in a very pro-Kremlin journal. And then there's a guy called Ryzhkov. He's very prominent. And all these people have got followings, and what they report what they see, and they pull in stuff that people just get on their phones, and they interpret it. And the interpretation is always pro-war. That's the point. None of it is anti-war. And from our point of view, as Western analysts, we look at these Telegram channels, and sometimes in the original, sometimes in translation, and they do tell a sort of truth because they report what they see. So, and they're allowed to continue because none of them are anti-war. And even if they were anti-war, it would be hard to stop them getting their stuff out there. And the Telegram channel is watched by a lot of people in Russia. It would be, even if Putin decided he's going to close the Telegram channel down, that actually would be a bit of a problem.
But it also has a purpose for Putin, doesn't it? Because it allows him to say, oh, well, there's opposition out there. We have free speech in this country.
I'm not the worst.
Yeah, exactly.
And every night on Russian state-sponsored TV, there are nightly discussion programs where the most bloodthirsty things are said, usually against Britain. And I mean, night after night, and I see quite a lot of these things. People talk about we should nuke Britain. Britain is the problem here. We should just get them off the map. And why does the Kremlin allow it? That's not Kremlin policy by any stretch whatsoever. But why do they allow it to happen? Because it shows that there's another side to this, and that they are. It's a safety valve. It lets people sound off their frustration that this war is going on, and it allows Putin to be the statesman.
On the battlefield itself, I suppose we should return back to that. This week we had a couple of extraordinary reports from John Sparks in this area called the kill zone. This is this sort of no man's land area, almost the border between Russian fighting and Ukraine fighting. What have we learned about the kind of warfare that's being used there this week?
It's unique in the sense that nobody's seen this before. We all call it the drone war, but it's actually the war of robotics. And so this kill zone, which in some parts of the front is maybe 5 kilometres wide, and in other parts is up to 35, some say 40 kilometres or more. And in the kill zone, whoever you are, Ukrainian or Russian, you're in severe danger if you show yourself anywhere. So people are crawling around with thermal blankets over them to try and prevent a heat signature. And they're staying in their dugouts, they're moving around very quietly and secretly. And there's almost no vehicles moving in the kill zone, because as soon as a vehicle is seen, it can be targeted. And so the character of warfare in this case is something that a lot of the militaries around the world are watching. And it's not to say that the next war somewhere else will be a drone war like this one, because this is particular to Ukraine and the terrain and the nature of the forces. But undoubtedly, we've not seen anything like this in the 20th century or this part of the 21st century, where the front line is this area of small islands of troops on both sides, overlapping each other, fighting each other in a very local area, half a kilometre here, quarter of a kilometre there. They're trying to clear them out of a farm building, and there'll be a battle for the farm. Then there'll be a battle over some dugouts. And they won't know exactly where the front line is. And people have to be supplied. They dig themselves in. They stay there sometimes for weeks, and they're supplied by drone if they can get the drones in, if the drones don't get destroyed. And so ammunition and food and water is droned into them at night. It's an astonishing turn of events. it won't be like this forever, but this phase of the war, we're into the third different sort of war in Ukraine. And this third phase of the war is one that imposes a kind of, it's not stalemate, because there's still 1,000 Russian troops a day are dying, and probably 200 to 300 Ukrainian troops on most days. So still the war is taking a lot of life. But the front lines, such as they are, these kill zones aren't moving very much. Other things are happening in the war, things happening in the Black Sea, things happening in the air. But on the ground, which is what everybody looks at, we've got this really curious kind of war going on, and that's all created by the ubiquity of drones, how cheap they are, how deadly they are. And unlike an artillery shell, you know, a soldier takes his chances in an artillery barrage, but a drone, if it spots you, can follow you into the dugout. Yeah.
It's like watching technology in real time, isn't it?
Yeah.
How it's progressed over just the course of this one war.
Yeah, and you know, I was talking to somebody last night, and he said that when he went to Ukraine a year ago, the Ukrainians were using 1,000 drones in the air on any given day last year. This year it's 3,000 in the air on any given day, 3,000 drones, and the Russians are flying about 5,000 drones a day on any given day. And that's so the air up to 3,000 feet is thick with drones.
It's terrifying. Nandi has asked about the Pokrovsk region. Why is Ukraine holding on to this despite being almost surrounded, especially after the past experiences of chaotic withdrawals? Is it not better to live to fight another day, they ask?
Of course, yeah. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about chaotic withdrawals. The Ukrainians haven't exactly covered themselves in glory when they withdrew from Avdiivka. I mean, they were good when they withdrew from Severodonetsk. This is going back 18 months now, and Lysychansk. They did that pretty well. But then they got caught in Bakhmut. The withdrawal from Bakhmut wasn't so good, even though they fought incredibly well for it. And the withdrawal from Avdiivka was chaotic. That was very poor, and that was strategic. Bakhmut wasn't very important strategically, but Avdiivka was. And when they lost that was a big loss. And Pokrovsk would be a big loss, which is one reason that they won't withdraw unless they absolutely have to, which is the answer to the second part of the question. But the reason that Pokrovsk is important is for two reasons. One is because it can open up the routes to the north towards Kramatorsk and Kramatorsk and Kostiantynivka. And Slavyansk, that was the other one. Slavyansk, Kramatorsk. They always go together.
I'm not helping you out here.
No, it's all right. The S in the case, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk. So it opens up. Those are the two really key places, and it opens up the road north to there. And it would also open up a road west to Dnipro, which again is a long way west. But Dnipro is in a different region, and that really would be another big Russian step towards trying to take all of the territory east of the Dnieper River. So Pokrovsk is in a sort of pivotal position, and the Ukrainians have held on, but they're now fighting in the middle of Pokrovsk. The Russians thought they were taking Pokrovsk from the very beginning of the year. It's been their main focus of effort, and they've surrounded it north and south. They're in the middle, but like the middle is now the kill zone, as we're talking about. And so in a way, they can't now sweep in and just occupy the place because the Ukrainians are there in little pockets and they're still fighting. Personally, I think Pokrovsk will fall. And, you know, our questioner is absolutely right. The Ukrainians, when they feel they have to withdraw, have got to do it better than they have done in the past. But they're holding on as long as possible into the winter because they don't want the Russians to be able to use it as the jumping off point to go north and to go west.
And you say the Ukrainians pulling out. The Kremlin's also saying that its troops are hearing foreign fighters on the battlefield on the Ukrainian side, and that they're going to be destroyed. Glenn Money and Bainbridge has said Putin's always going berserk about foreign fighters in Ukraine. Of course, we know that Russia is using them all the time. Is it true Zelenskyy is using them, or is it just foreign legions or mercenaries?
Yeah, there's an international legion, so-called international legion, which is basically a brigade. So it's a brigade structure. And in that includes, you know, young men. There may be some women in it, but I don't know of any. But there may be, from all over the world. And I've known some of the Brits and Canadians who went into it. I used to talk to them on a regular basis when they were in Bakhmut. They're pulled out of that now, of course. But the International Legion is essentially, most of what it does is intelligence, assessment, and some specialist stuff. I mean, some of these are, you know, very experienced soldiers from other armies. And they do specialist work, and some of it's special forces work. And then there's always, like in any army, there are foreign nationals who join the Ukrainian army. You know, Sean Pinner, remember him who was a prisoner? Well, he joined the Ukrainian army. Yeah. I mean, if you go to any British army unit, infantry units in the British. You'll find Fijians, Canadians, Samoans, and those nationals of other states. They've signed up and they're fighting with the British Army for the next 10 or 12 years. It's their career choice. So that's not unusual. And Ukrainians, you've got a number of foreigners in their army regularly, and there's this international legion. Now, the legion was at its height in numerical terms in about 2023. The first year of the war. There was enormous sympathy for Ukraine. Essentially, the Ukrainians could throw the Russians back. And some said that the International Legion numbered up to 30,000. That was pretty big. Now, I'd be surprised if it was more than 2,000, 2,500, 3,000. I'm guessing.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I bet you it's down to that sort of level because the war is a different sort of war. So, yes, it exists. The Russians do the same. Of course, they use private military companies. The Wagner Group, all of the big Russian commanders had their own private militias. Shogun, who was the defense minister, he had his own private militia of several thousand people. And these militias were all fighting for the Russians, which is one of the reasons the Russians did so badly, because they didn't have a united command structure at all. They had a Russian army and lots of other little forces who were doing their own thing, basically, like the Wagner Group, who've since been reabsorbed. So it's not at all unusual. The Russians make much more use of foreign forces than Ukraine does, and Ukraine's use is normal recruitment into Ukrainian units for some people, if that's what they want, or the International Legion, which kind of goes up and down with time. I used to speak to a couple of British lads in particular who were there, and I used to have some regular conversation with them when they were in Bakhmut. And sometimes we're in the basement of the building, and they say, "Hang on," and you'd hear this, the screen would sort of flicker, and they say, "Oh, that was a big one up on top," and they were literally sitting there under artillery fire, doing an intelligence job. And I remember meeting two of them in London when they came out, and one lad was saying, "Well, I'm thinking of going back. I've got a Ukrainian girlfriend." I said, "Well, that's a reason." He said, "I'm not sure." And and as he was speaking to me, his eyes were flicking around. He had the 1,000-yard stare. He was a classic of a young man who'd come out of a combat zone. He I wouldn't say he couldn't sit still, but his eyes couldn't focus on anything. He was flicking around all the time. And I thought, there's a man who's lived under an artillery bombardment. So people go in and out, and some of them, they come out and have a break, and then they go back for 6 months. It's a very irregular process, but it happens.
We're drawing to the end, so I suppose we should move on to very quickly what's happening in China this week in terms of President Trump being in the Far East. He's holding talks with the Chinese President Xi. Of course, China have been supporting Russia. Alex asks, what are the chances that Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping in South Korea this week might bring any results on at least a ceasefire?
Well, I'm sure that the Americans will raise it with the Chinese. I'm sure Trump will raise with Xi Jinping. What he will say, I'm sure, that we need to lean more heavily on Putin. We need to get this war finished. And the point is the Chinese don't want this war to finish because it's quite useful for them for all sorts of other reasons. But equally, the Chinese know it's all part of the relationship with the United States. So I think what President Trump ought to be saying to Xi Jinping, and what the staff ought to be saying to Chinese staff, is, look, we know you do this. We know that you're supplying components. Stop doing it. Stop it. At least bring it down. Reduce the level of support to something that we can live with. Give us a chance to create a ceasefire. And after all, a ceasefire will still achieve a lot of your global objectives in terms of Russia. And it would stabilize lots of other things. So I think the Americans will try and lean on the Chinese. How the Chinese react, I've no sense of at the moment. We'll see. They'll appear not to react, but then they will go away and think about it.
And we shall pick up next week and find out if we get anything from it. Michael, thank you so much as ever. Always illuminating to talk to you and probe your expertise. Thank you too for sending in all of your questions. Keep them coming, and Michael will be back with more of his answers to your questions next week.